So welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. I'm Lucy. I'm a writer of fantasy and romantasy books. I create writing content and cozy videos on this YouTube channel, and I also work in the publishing industry where I have worked for over 11 years. So as you can tell, writing and books are kind of my thing. It's something I've always done or been a part of. And what I really wanted to do in this video was tell you guys about every single project that I've written and what it is about that project that I've learnt or kind of realised didn't work. I also apologise if there's a slight echo in here and the background is very barren. I'm in the middle of moving, so yeah, my house is looking very empty and bare. I also want to credit Chris's video, who is on YouTube as KM Fiado, who is an incredible author tuber and makes brilliant videos on writing. She created a similar video kind of going through all of her kind of other projects and what she kind of learned about them, and that inspired this video. I will leave her channel down in the description bar. But let's get cracking, because I have 8 books that I want to tell you about. So 3 of these books I have finished in full. They are completed books, but every single book before that I never managed to finish, and this is for numerous different reasons, which I'm going to go into. So let's start at the beginning, because I've been writing for a very long time, so actually being able to choose these 8 projects was quite difficult. And that is because any project I'd worked on before these 8 projects, I don't have a record of on my laptop anymore. So I know for a fact that I wrote 50,000 words of a project in 2013, 2012, that I have no like files of anymore. Like, it's just basically gone from my laptop, which is a huge shame, because that was the first time I'd ever participated in NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month, which is no longer a thing due to many different reasons that we won't go into here. I also wrote a lot of fan fiction, like in my teenage years, mainly Twilight fan fiction, not gonna lie. That's how I feel like loads of us probably started with writing, is writing fanfic. I also did a creative writing module during my first year of uni, so I wrote a load of projects for my coursework as part of that, which I sadly don't think I have either, which is a real shame, because some of those projects I remember being like really experimental and quite different. So this was when I first moved to London. I was, how old was I? 22, I want to say. And this is the first project that I have on my laptop, you know, from those early years. So let's start at the beginning of my kind of record of all the books that I have on my laptop and go through them all and the reasons why they didn't work. We are going back to 2014 and the start of this video, which is my novel, which I called Of Satin and Steel. So let me kind of give you the vibe of this novel. This was a female knight story, and I love that female knights are having a moment right now, like The Knight and the Moth and other brilliant stories, because I was writing this in 2014. Like, I had an obsession with the idea of like female knights, and the concept of this story was following a girl who was an orphan. She was taken in by this kind of, you know, very famous knight and his family, and she grew up kind of emulating him and his son, who there is a romance between those two. Now, bearing in mind, I never completed this. This is currently incomplete at 12,898 words. And if I could pitch this story to you, it is a YA fantasy book that's very heavily inspired by Throne of Glass. I'm not gonna lie, this was when I was really in my Sarah J Maas era. I was there for every publication. It was part of my psyche, basically. So I was really inspired by that series, as I'm sure lots of us were. And so I wanted to write kind of traditional, like medieval inspired fantasy series, but featuring a female knight. And a little twist to this tale is that there is actually a kind of god story as well. So that is woven in with this kind of background of this kind of saint or god called Vria, very hard to say, who was a female knight and was like killed for that, essentially. And my main character grows up kind of wanting to emulate her life. Now, there is also a love triangle. And before I go and tell you why this book didn't work, I want to read you the first sentence / first paragraph. You can basically tell that I was younger writing this, because the writing is not very good compared to how I'm writing now. So it starts off as, there is always that blissful part of childhood where ignorance presides over truth, where hope and opportunity crush doubt and limitations. Those days where the sun never sets and the entire world is yours for the taking. Fresh green days where one day never led to the next. Each day was brand new, a slate wiped clean. Those days where dragons could be slain with swords of wood, where princesses could be awoken with a single press of lips, where a little girl with braids of flax and gold could forge a shield and call herself a knight. So reading that back, I take it back. I feel like that's, considering how early I was in my writing career, that's pretty okay. So let's go into the reasons why, sadly, this didn't work and why I didn't finish it. The writer, Lucy of 2014, did not know how to outline or plot a novel. Now, I hid behind the identity of Pantser, and this is going to be a common theme throughout this entire video. So with Of Satin and Steel, I was writing off pure vibes. I got this great idea. I would note down a few things that would happen in my forthcoming chapters as and when I got to it. So the reason why this book didn't work and what I kind of learned from that was, A, we really need to outline better. We really do. And I think looking back at my earlier projects, it's really clear that I was so against outlining, I was against planning, that I kind of like used that as like a, oh, but I'm a pantser, so I can't do that. But actually I would reach a point either within the first third of the story or the first, the first half of the story. I'd get to a certain point where I didn't know where the story was going. I didn't know like what the central plot was, and that was always where I would reach a natural stopping point where my inspiration and the vibes can only get me so far, and I just didn't know where the book was going. So I feel like the concept with me is always the thing that comes first, and I would just carry on with that until I just ran out of steam. So that was Of Satin and Steel 2014, and that was, yeah, my Throne of Glass inspired female knight story, which I still have a big like love for. And my character, I think she's called Aurelia, and I just remember her well. I don't know, it's just lovely. So anyway, moving on to what we are going to call Project Hunter. I think there was a title that I put down somewhere called Bones of Bark and Moss, or something like A Darkness Slowly Burning. None of these titles made sense to the plot, guys. Anyway, we're going to call it Project Hunter. And this is a YA fantasy that mixes the kind of story of the colony of Roanoke with the Robin Hood myth, but also a kind of myth in English folklore called Herne the Hunter. So this concept is so good, and maybe I'll go back one day and try and flesh this out, because the concept came to me like really clearly, and it was such a cool concept, and I really loved writing it. So this was probably a project I started writing in 2015, and this follows our main character Ray, who grows up in this village where she goes out one day like scavenging or like hunting in the woods, and she comes back and her entire village has disappeared, including her mother, her father, and her little sister. And there is no trace of them. It's like a very haunting, eerie kind of beginning of the novel where like there's no reason why her entire village would disappear, but they're gone. So really inspired by that Roanoke story. Then she ends up, for survival, having to live in the forest. So this is really like where the Robin Hood inspired elements come in, and also the element of Herne the Hunter, because when our main character Ray finds her village completely deserted, in the distance she sees this spectral half man, half deer figure. And that's the myth of Herne the Hunter, and that's what I really wanted to weave in there. And I can't remember what we call this spectral like deer person. What's his name? Hild the Hunter. So I wasn't very creative there with my changing of the name. So Hild the Hunter is, yeah, they're kind of like ominous, mysterious figure. And this brings to modern day. The first chapter kicks off in modern day, where Ray has found family within the forest. There's a community of basically like people who are living in the forest. That's that real like Robin Hood inspired vibe there. And this group of people living in the forest, they survive by essentially like robbing from the guards, from, kind of the people in power, which is that real kind of Robin Hood vibe. But then Ray stumbles into somebody in the forest who she finds out is actually on a mission from the king to find out what's happened to these villages that have gone missing. And he is connecting the dots between the villages that are going missing and Hild the Hunter. and that's where the kind of central story kicks off. So they join up forces and they try and explore this mystery together. So it's a real like forest-based YA fantasy featuring like mystery, folklore, etc. Now let me read you the first little few lines before we go into why this doesn't work. So it starts off as, the moon was bleeding that night. An omen, the villagers whispered, as they harvested the last of the crops for that year, but I didn't believe in omens. Not then. I wouldn't have known then that they would mold my life, that they would follow me wherever I went. I wouldn't have known that I would no longer measure time in minutes, by the arrows on a clock, but by the churning in my stomach and the dread coursing through my veins. And this is where Ray stumbles upon the missing village. So the reason why this didn't work is, I'm going to sound like a broken record, it is the lack of outline. I just didn't outline this. So I had a really cool concept, but I didn't know like where the story was going. I didn't really know why Hild the Hunter, who he was. I mean, I guess I had this idea that he was like this kind of like mythical figure, this kind of ghost, this phantom, who would basically be an omen. So I was obsessed with this idea of omens and, you know, seeing an omen and that leading to doom or kind of like a big tragedy. So I was like playing around with that idea. But I think the reason again that this didn't work was because I didn't outline properly. I didn't understand story structure. I didn't understand that like where we need certain big moments, certain kind of cliffhangers, why I need to actually map out things like plot and why it's helpful. But I did write 50,000 words of this project. So maybe one day I will go back to Project Hunter. I still think it's a really cool vibe, but yeah, sadly, I just got to the 50,000 word mark. And again, because in NaNoWriMo you're supposed to write 50,000 words, a big theme of mine and of this video will be I reached 50,000 words and then stopped. So I never continued with this book. I think that's because I ran out of steam, I didn't know where it was going, I got to 50,000 words and I was like, great, I don't have to do this anymore, I'm stopping. So that was Project Hunter, and yeah, I might go back to that book eventually. Okay, next we have Project Dreamwalker. This is like a 2016 book, I think. So this was my nano project for 2016. So this one is a bit of an unusual one. It is about a girl who has these prophetic dreams. You'll sense a theme going on as well in my writing. I am obsessed with prophetic dreams, like people who have dreams predicting the future. This comes up in a lot of my novels. So Project Dreamwalker follows Rosalind, whose father essentially sells her to the royal family for her gift because she can see the future and the royal family want to use that to their own advantage. And they also want to weave this into their bloodline. And to do that, she has an arranged marriage to the prince. And yeah, they kind of like, there's a romance there, etc. I only got 25,700 words into this book, which is probably, yeah, not ideal. I obviously failed that NaNoWriMo year. So the novel starts off with Rosalind predicting the death of her mother. And then it jumps to present day where she is being sold by her father to the queen, who then takes her away to this palace and, you know, forces her to marry the prince. And there is something else going on there. I think the prince as well, his brother was murdered by his own parents. Like, it's a little bit far-fetched, a little bit cliche, and I think that's maybe why I stopped writing it. But anyway, let me read you the first few lines. So it starts off as, straight through the darkness she raced, moonlight's child, alabaster skin cutting through the shadows. Rosalind had no idea how long she had been running, in frantic chase hoping to see her, to get to her in time. She was heading for the woods out of instinct as the night beckoned her forward. At last, a shadow crossed over the skirts of the woodland, just coming into view. Rosalind saw her, walking a death march towards the trees. Frost clung to the pines, but the girl could not feel the ice beneath her naked feet. So I think the concept is quite cool, but not very original. And again, the reason why this didn't really fully work was because I just think I lost interest in the story. I didn't obviously plot it out properly. I didn't know like much about the love interest Cass and who is the prince, and the kind of conspiracy within his family about why his brother died and all of that type of stuff. But he's also going through stuff too, and that's why him and kind of Rosalind have this like enemies to lovers dynamic, because they both are not very trusting. I think I just lost steam in the story. I didn't fully believe in it enough, I guess. I just really was obsessed with like forced or arranged marriage tropes, because I love a forced or arranged marriage trope. I don't know what that says about me, but I think they're really fun. Anyway, I like the kind of court fantasy. I've always written court fantasies, guys. Like, I just love a royal court, and I think that kind of stems from my love of history, especially like the Plantagenet dynasty, essentially. Like, English monarchs are my like mastermind subject, you know. I love all things history. So I think that's always woven into a lot of my earlier stories, is that historical fantasy where they're very much inspired by a time period. And you'll see kind of a concept here going forward here as well. So that was Project Dreamwalker. I didn't get very far at all. I wrote, let me see, I wrote 4 chapters. And this is cool because this was my Elizabeth of York / War of the Roses inspired YA fantasy novel. I am a big, as I say, Plantagenet history fan. If you don't know who the Plantagenets are, it's the dynasty that, or the kind of like royal family that ruled for hundreds of years before the Tudors. So they kind of were replaced by the Tudor dynasty. Anyway, obsessed with the Plantagenets, and the story of Elizabeth who married Henry VII always fascinated me. How she was kind of obviously part of the York dynasty, but then ended up marrying the Lancastrian dynasty, and all of that history around there. So the Wars of the Roses are like, I find fascinating, and I really wanted to write a YA fantasy book exploring this. So what this sees is our main character Thea, whose sister is getting married to the prince of a rival nation. This is to unite the 2 countries in order to bring peace to both of their lands. Now, on the wedding day, Thea's sister dies at the altar as she's about to be wed to her prince. And I just saw that scene really clearly about somebody who died on the altar on their wedding day, and the chaos that comes out of that kind of like marriage of convenience and that kind of alliance that is threatened. So as soon as she dies, it's clear she's been poisoned by someone. All hell breaks loose, and Thea's family try to run back to their country. They are going to start war. But Thea is caught in the kind of hubbub, and she is captured by that rival family whose country they are in and who her sister, you know, was going to be married to. So she is basically a like captive within this royal family, like, and they are still planning on going through with the wedding, but with Thea marrying the prince instead. So that's kind of the Elizabeth of York vibe, where she was pledged in marriage to the other kind of dynasty, the other house. So I really love this idea, but I just lost steam. Again, I didn't plan this book, guys. I didn't outline at all. And that's why I got to chapter 4 and I was like, who knows where this book is going? I'm gonna give up. Oh, yeah, I'm just annoyed at myself because I feel like maybe I could have been agented or had a book deal by now if I just learned how to finish a novel. And that's something I'd never done up until this point. I've never finished a novel by this point. I've never finished writing a project. And that is like the biggest hurdle I was overcoming, because I felt like I don't know what it's like to finish something and edit that thing. But we're getting there, don't you worry. So let me read you the opening to Project Roses. Thea twisted honeysuckle and violets between the honeyed curls piled on her sister's head. Gwen had always been radiant, her golden hair more like an aura, a symbol of her purity and goodness. It was what every daughter of Dormir had been brought up to aspire to. There now, Madeline smoothed down a wayward curl as Gwen rose from the hard cast iron chair. You look every inch the blooming bride. Thea watched Gwen blush. Her sister had never been adept at accepting compliments, never craved them, not like Thea did. She wondered if that made her wrong somehow, more like an Ironshaw than a Dormian. If it wasn't for her own fair hair and grey eyes, Thea would have begun to worry about her heritage. And then we go on, it's basically her helping her sister get ready for her wedding. And then, obviously, that doesn't end well. So that was Project Roses. Really loved the kind of vibe of that, like the kind of Wars of the Roses, you know, inspired setting. Really fun. I just wish I finished it. Anyway, we are getting there. So the next project I worked on is Project Scavenger. This was 2017, and this was my novel inspired by Les Miserables. And in particular, the characters of Eponine and Enjolras, who I was reading a lot of fan fiction about this time, guys. I was obsessed with the potential of them two falling for each other. Obviously, Eponine is kind of that kind of street urchin, you know, that girl who is in love with somebody who doesn't love her back. And then Enjolras is this kind of like revolutionary leader who is so determined. He will do anything to achieve what he wants, even if that comes at the cost of lives. So I was obsessed with that dynamic, and that led me to my YA scavenger novel. So it's YA fantasy, and I wrote 18 chapters of that novel, which equates to 47,500 words. Again, I got to the almost 50,000 needed for NaNoWriMo that year, and I gave up. This novel is so cool. I just wish I finished it. Maybe I'll go back and properly outline, because again, Lucy doesn't outline at this point. She just doesn't believe in it. So yeah, this follows Violet, who is an orphan. And when she is orphaned, she has to look after her little sister, Pip. And she lives on the streets, but she does everything to try to make enough money to fund Pippa's kind of boarding school education. So she is stealing, she is in with the kind of criminal underworld in order to pay for her sister's monthly tuition to this boarding school. And that's her main motivation, is like keeping her sister away from the streets, in, you know, getting an education, keeping her fed and with a roof over her head. But Violet will do anything to achieve that. Includes getting involved with this kind of criminal gang. Now the book opens with Violet on the periphery of a battleground with another criminal called Bry. And Violet's goal here is to wait until the battle is finished and then scavenge the bodies of the battlefield for any trinkets or anything she can sell. So there's a whole group of these criminals waiting in the periphery for the end of the battle and then looting the corpses. And that's how she will hopefully get enough money to continue to fund her sister's education and livelihood. But then she gets embroiled into the rebellion, who is kind of at the heart of this battle. So it's the royal family versus the rebellion. This is what this battle is. So she eventually gets embroiled into that, and that's where the Les Mis inspired, you know, bits come in, where essentially she has an enemies to lovers situation with the head of this rebellion, and they eventually come to an understanding and they realize they have to work together in order to bring this rebellion to life. Let me kick you off with a little taste of the writing. So it starts as: the world before her was painted red. It stained the grass, the branches of trees, the very earth itself. Metal chimed against metal, the air shuddering in response. This is what hell looks like, the girl thought, hidden amongst the rocks. From this height, Violet could make out the bannerman of the king's army, the golden sun smattered with crimson. The opposing side was just as bloody, the colours of the Spiritan army impossible to see, the burgundy banners matching the bodies beneath. Violet looked up at the birds circling, waiting for their victory, looting the corpses of their tissue and skin. It wasn't too far apart from Violet's own plans, nor the plans of the others who had gathered near the periphery of the battle to wait. Next to her, Bry watched the slaughter with cold indifference. Violet looked away, studying her nails, marveling that no matter how many times she scrubbed, the caked layers of dirt wouldn't wash away. She tried to pick out the sound of the wind as it whistled through the trees instead of the strangled cries of men. Hurry up, hurry up. Time played a merry dance with her, minutes turning to hours, until the screams became the soft rattle of dying breaths. So having just read over like that first paragraph, there's so much potential there. I do just feel like maybe I should go back, because I remember how much I loved writing that story, and it's just a shame again that I didn't outline it. And this is really where the learning comes in, because I feel like with this story I had a great concept. My writing was finally at a place where I felt confident with it, but I couldn't finish the novel. Like, I didn't finish it because I didn't outline. And that brings me nicely onto the first book that I ever properly finished in full, and that book is another YA fantasy called To Steal the Seas, and this is my YA pirate fantasy. I am obsessed with this book. It follows a pair of twins, Imi and Kian, who grow up in this awful town, and They both have their own issues to work through. They are not very good at communicating with each other. But Imi has prophetic dreams, and that's where this comes full circle. I was going to use those prophetic dreams device again, of course. So Imi can dream of things and they will happen, and that's what happened with the death of her parents. But because of Imi's unique gift, she is the favorite of the local gambling hell, where she is kind of forced to work for this awful kind of mob boss called Ray. And that's kind of where we start the novel. Kian is a fisherman, and when he's finished for the day, he goes to the local inn where he hears whispers that a famous pirate ship have been spotted off the town's shores. And this pirate ship is called the Stiora, and it is captained by Captain Cutthroat Radley, who is the most feared pirate of the Kainorian seas. And basically, long story short, Kian ends up getting kidnapped by this pirate. Imi has to go on this big journey to save him, to rescue him. So it's kind of dual narrative. We get Imi's point of view, we get Kian's point of view. There is a love story on both sides, but I must say Kian's love story with Captain Cutthroat Radley is my absolute favorite. And so it does have a queer romance in that sense. And oh my God, I loved writing this book so much. It was so much fun. So you might be thinking, hooray, finally finished a novel. It is complete. Where did it all go wrong? Why has this novel not been queried? It's just been kind of left on my device, essentially just collecting dust. Well, I do want to go back to it to see if I can fix it, because there is a big issue here, and that is the plot. I had wrapped myself in so many plot holes. I wasn't convinced by the central premise of the story, and I wrote myself in circles with a lot of things. I think it's too convoluted, it's too complicated. There are too many plot strands in there that don't make sense. And I also feel like maybe I forced a romance too quickly from Imi's point of view, because she does end up hooking up with this guy who she meets on the road. He turns out to be a prince, of course. So I feel like there's parts of it that are too cliche, and that's why as soon as I finished it, went back to edit it, I thought this isn't the one. It's like my gut and my heart were telling me like, this isn't the novel that you query with, like you need to wait, you need to do something different. This is also the last YA book I wrote. And I think that's because I had stopped reading YA by the time I'd finished writing this book. And I kind of knew that if I wanted to get an agent, I don't think I was going to get one writing YA. So I decided after this to put a pin on YA and go into something else. But let me read you a few lines from To Still the Seas, as I really love this book. It's just a shame that like I just can't work out, or maybe I just don't have time to go back to it and edit it and sort it out, but maybe one day. So the story starts with a prologue. Kilcully 5 years ago. There is no wound that can sting quite so sharp as betrayal. The man, fresh out of boyhood, knew this. He felt it so keenly that he forgot completely about the puncture just below his ribs. Despite the blood that left a telltale trail across the Abbey's flagstones, the pain came squarely from his chest. It sent shockwaves through his broad frame, shot tremors through his skin. But despite the pain he ran, there was nothing else to do, though he knew leaving would bring a fresh wave of anguish. He would be branded a traitor, but at least he would live. So I actually added this prologue in after I finished writing the book. It just gives some sense as to one of my characters' backstories, which was really fun to kind of go back and write that. I think learnings from this is, again, I needed to move away from YA. I needed to try a different kind of vibe, a different genre. And I also needed to plot better. And that was really clear. And with all of those learnings, we are on to the book that finally got me an agent. And this is a book that when I was writing, I called it Season of Mists. And then when we went on submission to publishers last year, me and my agent, we renamed it An Ode to Immortality. So let me talk you through the vibes of this book. This was my first adult project. This was the book that came to me in the dead of night. I woke up and I had an idea for my next book. And I opened my phone notes app and I literally word vomited the plot of this book. I don't know why this came to me, but I think like there is something about that saying like, write what you know, write what you want to read. And I wanted to read a dark academia inspired novel all about the Romantic poets. and a circle of romantic poets who would do very dark things to achieve poetical greatness. And that was my kind of concept, is like, you know, a woman who desperately wants to be within this circle of great poets, but because she's a woman, there are obviously boundaries and there are limits to like her writing poetry and being famous for that. It was also inspired by my love of John Keats, the poet, and also my fascination with the Byron Shelley circle. And I just brought a lot of my kind of like academical research into this circle and John Keats's life. I wrote my dissertation on John Keats, so I am a huge Keats fan and I have studied him a lot and his poetry. So I want to weave all of that into a dark academia fantasy, historical fantasy novel that was adult. So that was where Season of Mists, or An Ode to Immortality, came in. It was gonna be dark. I wanted it to be also a doomed and tragic love story. Like, I didn't see a happy ending here. And if you're familiar with John Keats's life, you will kind of understand why. So I queried this book to 10 agents and I got an offer of representation within a month and a half, 2 months, which is very quick turnaround. And I kind of knew that this was the book to query because I was like crying when I finished this. It was like a real kind of experience of like knowing it was the right one. And because of this book, I signed with my wonderful agent and it kind of kick-started the beginning of my dream, essentially. So even though this book, because we did go on submission to publishers last year, it didn't get picked up last year. There's still hope for it, like one day. We never, you know, it's not off the table, it's still with certain publishers. But in my head, I've kind of filed it away as like, we'll come to that later, it might still get picked up down the line, you never know. I'm so proud of this project. And due to many reasons, I think it didn't get published, which I'm gonna go into in a second. So let me read you the first few lines of the prologue. Castle St. Clair, Scotland, 1815. The mirror, or what was left of it, was covered in blood. Jagged shards of glass littered the sapphire blue Axminster carpet as the man stared into the remains of the looking glass. His splintered reflection made him appear more beast than man, but the blood from his sliced knuckles reminded him all too harshly of his own humanity. His experiment had failed, despite doing everything he thought was right. He'd taken the exact dose of opiates he had deduced was needed. He found sweet oblivion, accepting the nothingness for so long that he could imagine the silken curtain of her golden blonde hair between his fingers. Yet, when the spell of his reverie broke, the man was painfully alone. Smashing his fist into the looking glass was confirmation enough. He had failed yet again and had the open wounds to prove it. The drawing room swayed as he stood up from the chaise to take his leave for the evening. Clearly the opium hadn't abandoned his body just yet. He would stop, he decided. He needed to stop. It was a unique form of torture, seeing the object of your desire so clearly, but being unable to grasp it. It had been years of searching, years of hope, and the crushing loss of it. Yes, he thought, that's enough. Yet, as Lord Benedict St. Clair stumbled into his bed that night, still fully dressed and slippered too, he allowed his mind to wander as it often did. He followed a poppy-lined path, unsure of his destination, feeling his eyelids droop and his restless limbs grow heavy. As he neared the oblivion of sleep, he sensed the air around him grow colder, though whether this was inside his mind or not, he couldn't muster the energy to guess. Again, that prologue didn't immediately come to me, that came after, and I just felt I needed something that would signpost that this is speculative, that there is a kind of supernatural element to this book. It's not just a historical fiction book. But so much of this book is purely historical fiction with a kind of touch of like, is this supernatural what's happening to them, or is it not? I feel that that was probably the biggest mistake of this novel, is either not making it fantasy enough, because like a lot of the feedback we had from publishers was it's too historical and it's not fantasy enough, or the other way around, is that like there's too much of the fantasy and the speculative in it. Also, historical fiction is a bit tricky right now. It's just a tricky time for historical fiction in the current publishing landscape. It's just not performing as well as it once was. So lots of publishers aren't going to take a bet on historical fiction potentially at the minute. So that's something else to consider. Anyway, I'm so proud of this. It got me my agent. And then we are going to go into my next project. I'm not going to say too much, but this is Project Shadow. And Project Shadow is Throne of the Fallen meets One Dark Window. It is a dark romantic fantasy that kind of is centered around spiritualism. It's set in Victorian England in the northeast around a mining community, and it features demons. So it's very dark, it's very delicious. It is quite spicy at times, and honestly writing those scenes I was like, oof, God, no one I know can ever read this. So it's really fun and I love it. And let me just read you the first line. Ava had always called out to the dark, but the dark was never supposed to answer back. And with that, I am going to leave you guys hanging, because whether or not this book failed, I'm gonna have to leave up for the mystery of this video, because maybe it's failed, maybe it hasn't failed. I will report back with news very, very soon. But I'm really obsessed with this book. I am full-blown obsessed with Project Shadow, and I can't wait for you to hopefully one day read this, because again, this was the book, as with An Ode to Immortality or Season of Mist, whatever we're calling that one, I finally have cracked being a plotter. I finally plot my novels, I finally plan my novels, and it is a beautiful place to be after 8 books that I've now arrived and can proudly say, for all intents and purposes, I've learned how to craft a novel and how to plot. And that doesn't mean that part of me doesn't allow pantsing to take over or kind of just to fill in the gaps, because I give myself a structure and then I allow my creativity to take over in certain moments. Like, I don't give myself a mega rigid structure, but I allow myself to fill in some gaps. And I feel like I finally worked out what works for me. And of course, every project is so different in terms of how much you end up plotting, how much you want to leave for your imagination. But I am now in the camp that I believe that it is important to properly outline and plot, guys. Oh gosh. Anyway, it's only taken me like 15 years to learn this from those days of writing Twilight fanfiction. But anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you found it interesting. It might just be me talking about my boring books, who knows? But I really hope you enjoyed this video, and please do let me know down in the comments, like, if you're a writer, what books are your failed books, or not failed, but books that you learnt the most from writing. Like, tell me about your books that maybe have taught you a lot along the way. I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. If you'd like to follow me on social media, I'm at BookBellReads everywhere, and you can follow for more behind the scenes content in my life and my writing journey, working in publishing, etc. And please don't forget to subscribe to this channel. It would mean the world to me that you're joining my lovely online family, and I'm very, very grateful that you're here watching this video. So thank you so much, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.